Thanks very much. I'm Stephanie Rennane, also from the Rand Corporation. I really enjoyed the opportunity to read this paper by Kathryn and Jeff, and look forward to sharing some thoughts about it with you today. So Kathryn did a really great job motivating this research, and I think I'm going to echo a lot of what she already said. But the way I kind of view this research is that there's a long and established literature contributed by many people in this room that document a lot of information about transfers, both from parents to children and from children to parents. So we know that children are, an important source of informal support to their parents when they reach old age or when they experience a health shock. And there's this growing literature also showing that parents provide assistance for their children, their adult children, around the time of economic shock. So we know, that there's this kind of reciprocal back and forth transfer between these two groups. But we know a lot less about, one, how these transfers are financed. So what are the impacts? We know kind of that there's these receivers of all these benefits, but we don't know as much about the impacts on the givers of this assistance. So this is where Kathryn and Jeff's paper tries to fill a gap in this literature and kind of enter to answer some of these questions. So first of all, how do parents finance their assistance to adult children is one key thing they look at. And then more broadly, what do we learn from that about the impact on parents' retirement, well-being, sort of the timing of when they might make some of these transitions into retirement later in life. So I loved the graphs in Kathryn's paper as well. So she pulled out two, and I was like, oh no, is she going to show the graph that I want to show? But she didn't, so I'll show you a new snapshot here. So this graph here along the x-axis is the age of the mother, and then it shows the share of mothers in that age who are sending a cash transfer to their children. And again, you can see this key peak, as Kathryn emphasized, right around this age. I guess it's a little cut off there at the bottom, but right around the age, 50s. Which is important, as she mentioned, because these are crucial years if you want to think about sort of peak earnings, peak labor force participation for adults. You want them to be increasing their savings and maybe not drawing them down at this point to assist children. And also there was a comment earlier today about the sandwich generation, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about for this age group as well. So we know from this graph that they're assisting their adult children, but also could be at the age when they're assisting their parents as well. So that's clearly related, outside of the scope of her paper, but it's another source of, important kind of strain and tension for this population, particularly in recent years when there's been a lot of, changes in economic activity. So as Kathryn mentioned, she uses the panel study on income dynamics, and she observes adult children who are linked to their mothers. She mentioned, she makes a couple sample restrictions and mainly does that so that she has a really clean sample for her analysis, where she's not, not worried about losing people along, across waves. So she focuses on children who don't live with their parents, who are not co-resident with their parents, and also just focuses on mothers so that she can, avoid these separations as families change over time. But, so I think, in some ways, I took that to mean that what she's finding here is likely a lower bound on the response that we might see from parents. So as she mentioned, housing assistance is a really important source of assistance, particularly for this age group. And then also there could be source coming from these other parents that we're no longer able to observe. So in some ways, I think this is striking because it's important results even, kind of at a lower bound of what we might see if we were able to observe everything in the sample. And then because she's able to observe people over time, she's able to kind of condition for the fact that some families, some mothers might just on average be more likely to provide transfers to their children and focus on variation around the time of an unemployment shock. So again, she mentioned the caveats with thinking about whether this is a random shock or not, but I think regardless of that, it really shows important information about how families are responding and what these trends look like and these associations between parents and children. So her main findings, again, I'm just going to kind of lay these up here and then talk about my reactions to a lot of them. So as she said, she confirmed what other literature has shown, that there's monetary transfers from parents to children around the time that they experience this economic shock. That younger mothers increase their labor supply, and that slightly older mothers seem to kind of maybe hasten or take Social Security potentially slightly earlier than they might otherwise do. So I guess, there's this question of how should we think about this? Should we think about this as like a good thing or a bad thing? So we know these transfers have to happen. Presumably it's good for the child that they receive this income. We don't really want these mothers to be drawing down their assets earlier. So if they work a little bit more, maybe that's potentially a beneficial way for them to finance this assistance. I guess I was worried at first that we would see increase in Social Security taking among even younger mothers, right around the age of 62, maybe the early retirement age, and we don't see that happening, or she was finding that this was more concentrated among mothers who've maybe reached the full retirement age or are closer, but still they're taking it a little earlier than they otherwise might, which means, that's going to decrease their Social Security benefit. So there's some evidence there of some potential risk sharing that might have detrimental impacts on the parent. Again, I was surprised, as she mentioned, by kind of the size of these other shocks. So, it decreases food consumption, and some evidence that it decreased pension contributions and assets. Again, I think thinking about this as a lower bound, as Kathryn kind of alluded to, helps to maybe reconcile these large decreases that we see in food consumption. Another thought I had is that there could be not only adjustments and expectations for the parents about their children, but maybe for themselves as well. And so maybe they're kind of saving for their own future rather than thinking, I'm going to need to continue helping my child. But, if we're in a recession, they could be anticipating a risk to themselves and sort of maybe doing some precautionary savings on their own account as well, which could be another, these things are correlated, and I think that's an important component to think about here, is the way that the parents and children are kind of experiencing similar shocks at a certain point in time. So one thing Kathryn didn't mention, but it struck me and I think is an interesting thing to dive into a little bit more in the paper, is I think there was a stat that said a lot of these spells are reported as voluntary. So even though there's not exits from school, I would be curious to know a little bit more about how the survey defines a voluntary shock and whether that changes the way that we think about what these transfers mean. So there's, certainly one story that this is a risk sharing between different family members or different generations. But if these are voluntary spells, then it could be something planned in advance that maybe parents are almost viewing this as an investment for the future if they think their children are looking for a better job match, something that might give them higher earnings later on. Maybe they're helping them out in the meantime and anticipating to get transfers back from their children at a later point in time. So because I'm the discussant, I get to think about fun things that she can do to dive into this a little bit more. So I'd love to know more about how voluntary shock or unemployment spells are defined, and then sort of maybe do some comparison. This might be some interesting ways you can dive into that and test between the cases where it's reported as voluntary versus not, and see how the transfer activity changes. But I think this paper in general highlights some really important policy considerations that Kathryn did a great job of raising. So first, the way I took it, I took one thought away is we know that families form an important informal safety net, but another thing this means is that when we're thinking about transferring benefits, whether they're to the parent or the child, maybe we shouldn't just be thinking about this as going to the individual, but really going to the family. We know a lot of income is shared between family members in different generations. This could be going in both directions. So if we're thinking about things like unemployment insurance, that could be helping the parents by having them, keep their own retirement savings rather than sending it to the child. And similarly, retirement income, she's showing some evidence that could be passed through to the child as well. So when we're thinking about the costs and benefits of these programs, maybe we should be thinking more broadly about impacts on the family rather than focusing on the individual beneficiary. And then also, I was thinking a lot about these correlated shocks that we're looking specifically here at cases where children are experiencing unemployment. But we're also really worried about unemployment shocks among parents in this age, this kind of near retirement age, if it just kind of precipitates earlier retirement than what we otherwise might see. And again, maybe thinking about how this changes parents' expectations about their own future. So this raises some interesting things, again, if we're thinking about designing a social safety net policy and how this affects family members of different generations. It's an important consideration to keep in mind. And then I think this, my mind was going crazy with all kinds of interesting ways that Kathryn could continue this work. So I'm giving her a full research agenda going forward. So she shows some really clean graphs about kind of the timing of the transfer right at the time that the child experiences this unemployment spell. I would love to see graphs like that to see how the transfers persist over time. The responses to these transfers persist over time. So is it just that food consumption is reduced temporarily, or do we see that kind of a permanent change? Dive in a little bit more with marital status, family composition of both the parent and the child, maybe do some splits by gender as well, could be an interesting expansion. And then maybe to get at this question of whether we're looking at like a exchange or risk-sharing thing, look at whether you see any reverse transfers in the opposite direction later on once a child becomes employed again in the future. But thanks again, really interesting work, and I look forward to seeing more in the future.